Kristine Larsen is a professor of astronomy at Central Connecticut State University, where her teaching and research focus on the intersections between science and society. She's a frequent guest on Central Authors. Her publications include numerous articles and book chapters on J.A.R. Tolkien's use of astronomy in his works.
Thank you, Gil. And someday Gil will have to tell you about the honors course we team taught dealing with, of all people, Frank Sinatra and Stephen Hawking. I'll let you ponder what those two have in common. Besides, they're both deceased, not at the time. So today I'm not going to talk about Tolkien, even though Tolkien does play a minor role in this. I want to talk to you about an internationally best-selling series of books that has spawned a transmedia explosion, and that is the work of Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski. Now, a lot of people come to Sapkowski's Witcher series through the wildly popular computer games. Other people come through the live-action Netflix series. We've had 3 seasons so far. The last 2 are in pre-production as we speak. But it actually started with a short story and a competition. Sapkowski was not an author. He was trained in economics, traveling salesman, jack of all trades. And he read in a Polish fantasy and sci-fi magazine that they were having a competition for best short story. He said, why not? I read this stuff. How hard could it be to write something? So he writes a short story called Wiedźmin, meaning The Witcher, and it wins 3rd prize. And from that, he writes more short stories. He eventually collects them into books. He then starts writing a whole novel series about this character, the Witcher, and the rest, as they say, is history. So on your handout, you have a list of the books and all of the different adaptations. I highly sort of recommend the Polish TV series Wiedźmin. You can find it on archive.org. It's really interesting, and I put that in a very generous sense of the word. But one thing I want you to notice is the lag of time between when the books were initially published in Polish and when they came out in English. I first learned about Sapkowski's work in the early aughts from a student of mine, Patrick Hyland, who knew of my love for Tolkien. And he said, Dr. Larsen, you really have to read this work by Sapkowski. I'm like, who is this guy? And so he tells me about him, and I go and look it up. And I find out that only 2 of the books have appeared in English. So I dutifully buy them and read them, and I'm hooked. Nothing in sight about when the other books are going to occur in English translation. Fortunately, enterprising Polish fans had made their own English translations and posted them on the internet. So I actually burned lots of trees, downloading, printing out, and devouring these fan translations of Sapkowski's work into English. And to this day, I find those fan translations in some sense more enjoyable than the official translations, but don't tell the publisher that. So, in reading this book, why did my student tell me that I should read this? Not only is it great world building like Tolkien, but there's actually a lot of science in this. If you know anything about making a world like the Star Wars universe or the Middle-earth universe or the Star Trek universe, there are certain things that you need. You need different cultures, you need different geographies, you need languages, and you need science. You need the laws of nature by which the world operates. And Sapkowski's world has a kind of magic to it that certain people are trained and gifted to use. And he describes his magic as part chaos, part art, and part science. So right from the get-go, we have this idea that science is an integral part of this world. So to give you a little bit of a plot summary, which is on the handout, we have 3 main characters. We have the Witcher himself, Geralt of Rivia, portrayed by Henry Cavill of Superman fame. In the series, he is being recast by Liam Hemsworth which causes a lot of angst. He is a mutated monster hunter for hire. His on-again, off-again girlfriend, Yennefer von Bingen, she is a sorceress. And Geralt's adopted daughter, Ciri, who is the long-standing result of a genetic engineering experiment that sort of got a little out of hand. And she has incredible powers that she is trying to learn how to master. And among these powers is the ability to move from one dimension to another, from one universe to another, because Sapkowski's world takes place in a multiverse, if you've heard that term before. And in the grand scheme of this world, there was a cataclysmic event many, many centuries ago called the conjunction of the spheres, in which catastrophically all of these dimensions collided, and different creatures could move from one universe to the other. And one of the creatures that moved and ends up in Geralt's world is humans, as well as monsters. But Sapkowski has a really interesting sort of cynic, sarcastic humor. And in his world, the distinguishing factor between monsters and humans is that the monsters are usually better than the humans. So Geralt, being a monster hunter, means that sometimes the monsters he's hunting wear a human face. So there's a lot of interesting political and social commentary. So what are some of the hallmarks of Sapkowski's series? If you've heard the term fractured fairy tales, those of you of a certain age remember the cartoons. What you see when you read or watch anything in his universe is you go, that sounds like Snow White, or that sounds like The Little Mermaid, or that sounds like fill in your favorite folktale. Yes, he uses all of those folktales and puts a unique twist, usually rather sarcastic and cynical. It's not Tolkien where you have the good guy and the bad guy. Everybody's gray. Nobody is completely good. Nobody is completely bad, except the religious zealots. They're always bad. So there's a lot of gray, a lot of ethical gray. And he is literally drinking buddies with George R.R. Martin, which means do not get attached to your favorite character. Just a warning, okay? Racism is one of the central lessons in his universe. And his lesson is that racism is stupid and racism is bad. And racism is not just practiced between humans, but between all these different groups, between the dwarves and the elves and the humans, especially between the elves and the humans. And everybody hates the Witchers, even though it's not their fault they were genetically engineered in the first place. So there's a lot of really interesting commentary about racism in the form of what we call speciesism in his book. And of course, a lot of science. So to give you a little bit of idea about the genesis of the book, again, I had read all this. I had highlighted all the science in all of the writings. I had watched the Polish adaptation and the first season of the Netflix adaptation and put in my book contract, put in my book proposal. My contract was signed the first week of March, 2020. I want you to think what was going on Central's campus the first week of March in 2020. The world was about to end as we knew it. So I've just signed a book contract. I thought I was going to spend the rest of that year writing this book. Instead, as the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning on campus for faculty, I spent that year dedicating to help other colleagues teach online and HyFlex. So needless to say, that put off this book a bit. And there were other things that we wanted to wait for the second season of the Netflix series to be over. And so the point is the book, signed contract March of 2020, came out almost 3 years later. A lot of it outside of my control. So what are some of the scientific themes? And you can see that on the top of the back page. Oh, there's a lot of great stuff about superstitions, about people who think weird things about eclipses, and about comets, and about meteorites, Geralt has two swords, one to kill monsters and the other to kill humans, and it's made out of meteorite metal. Geralt is a scientist. He uses a scientific method. It's almost like a detective story. This horrible monster that no one's ever seen before has slaughtered all these people. How did they do it? It's a whodunit. He has to put together the clues. Very scientific. He works in a laboratory. The sorcerers and sorceresses are scientists. They deal with test tubes. They mix chemicals together, right? There's a lot of experimental science in there. And just like in a science fiction novel, you have the mad scientists, you have the mad scientists here. They're called sorcerers and sorceresses, but it's obvious who the Frankenstein characters are. And they literally have their own Frankensteinian monsters that they make. We have the ideas about science and politics, the tension between scientists and religion. We have stereotypes of scientists, especially prejudice against women scientists. We see that a lot in these works. There's also a lot about evolution and transhumanism and genetic engineering. There is a lot about infertility and infertility treatments, which is pretty interesting. Again, racism and the scientific basism for racism in the 19th and early 20th century. You also have eugenics, you have genocide, and including trying to stop groups you don't like from reproducing. A lot of really interesting politics, especially coming from someone from Poland. And speaking of Poland, you may not know, but Poland has been in the mid to late 20th century the most polluted country in Europe. There's a huge, very deep environmentalism thread throughout all of these works. A lot of lessons. The people who mistreat the environment, that's bad. People who support the environment, that's good. There's pandemics. Need I say more? There's traveling between parallel worlds and the multiverse. You've got that whole sort of physics thing involved. You've got weapons of mass destruction. And one of the biggest themes, which is unfortunately, as best I can tell, been completely ignored by the Netflix adaptation, is climate change. Climate change is central to Sapkowski's universe, but it's the opposite of the climate change that we see in our current world. It is not a warming of the world, it is a cooling of the world. Similar to what you might find in George R.R. Martin's, Winter is Coming. In Sapkowski's world, an ice age is coming. And just as in our current world, there are people who are, you can think of them as modern day prophets like Al Gore saying, inconvenient truth, climate's changing. And on the other hand, you have the deniers who refuse to see the evidence in front of their face. And again, considering when these works were written, they started to be written in the early 1990s, and the series was essentially finished by the end of that decade with the exception of one prequel. It's pretty much prescient in this idea of climate change and about the political tension there. So about a third of the way down on the back side of the handout, you have what's called the Prophecy of Ithlin. And this is an ancient prophecy about a time of white chill, a time of madness, time of content, the time of end. The world will die amidst frost and be reborn with the new sun. And a lot of the characters think that that's just crazy prophecy talk. But it is the truth. Because in Sapkowski's world, just like in our world, there are climatic cycles. And people who know science can look at the clues and can calculate when the next ice age may be based on these cycles. And these cycles all have to do with astronomy. So at the bottom of that, I have a picture of what's called the Milankovitch cycles. Anyone here heard of the Milankovitch cycles? I doubt you have. That's named after Milutin Milankovitch, who more than 100 years ago tried to figure out why they were seeing evidence of repeated ice ages in the geological record. And an earlier Scottish astronomer, James Kroll, had said, I wonder if it has to do with changes in the orbit of the Earth. And Milankovitch really put together what we understand as the current understanding. You all know the Earth orbits the sun, right? Don't have to tell you that. A lot of people have a misconception that the orbit of the Earth around the sun is an ellipse. It's really very close to a perfect circle. But if it changed shape a little bit, might that change the amount of sunlight that we get at different times of the year? Doesn't it make sense that that might hypothetically affect our climate? That's one aspect. Okay? Hopefully you know that the Earth is tilted by 23.5 degrees. That's what causes our seasons. If the amount of tilt changed, doesn't it make sense that that would also change our seasons, and with that change our climate? And the Earth is tilted at the North Star. If the Earth were tilted at a different place in the sky, then winter and summer would occur at different points in the Earth's orbit. Might that have a slight change in the amount of sunlight you get in the northern or southern hemisphere, and therefore change our seasons and our climate? These are all small changes. They are all cycles that can be predicted. And it turns out that they work together to explain, over the last 2 million years, ice ages that we see. Sapkowski apparently read up on this and included a lot of it in his saga. And I've given you some quotes. There are these huge, mind-numbing passages of exposition, which any English professor would tell you never to write. But when scientists are reading your work, they're like, yeah, great stuff. The science is pretty good for an imaginary world. So he is putting together this idea of an ancient people coding their knowledge as a prophecy. Modern scientists finding out that there's truth in that and trying to warn people that this is happening. And then you have the people going, yeah, nothing to see here, move along, I don't believe it. But then in a passage that I give you at the very end, you have someone saying, have you ever noticed that crops that used to grow in certain places don't grow there anymore? Do you notice that plants are blooming later and later in the year? Do you notice that harbors are freezing over that never froze over before? The evidence is right in front of you. We can no longer deny that this ice age is coming. And so there's a great message, I think, in this about climate change, about science, about people who want to turn a blind eye to what science says, and also how science can be misused. Again, there's a lot about weapons of mass destruction, misuses of technology, and scientists doing illicit experimentation on people. So there is so much there that I could get a whole book about it. So that's my overview. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Questions?
I didn't notice. Is he still alive?
He's still alive. Yep. He's actually working on supposedly he's working on another prequel. He's claimed that the series is done. If you don't like the ending, tough luck. And that he might be writing more filler tales or prequels.
I'm fascinated by the title, right? Mm-hmm. So the Polish, it looks like the Polish, a simple translation is just the hexer, mm-hmm. right?
Yep.
A hex, of course, is a spell of whatever. Witcher, is there an explanation for that?
The translation has changed over time as to what it actually means. There is no really good term for a genetically modified monster hunter who uses equal parts science and magic to kill them, and brute strength and his own superpowers to kill the monster. So don't read, pretty much what Sapkowski's, don't read too much into what the name is. It's just, what is the job? What does he do? So what Geralt does is he uses all of these powers that he's been given, plus his knowledge, to hunt down and dispose of monsters.
Is there a source of the magic, right? So, I mean, or, you know, kind of, or, I mean, so you've got science, you've got magic, and many would say those are opposing kind of things, right?
Yeah.
But
Here it's one. And it's not, he leaves a lot unsaid. He was not like Tolkien, who had to like explain everything in a footnote somewhere in one of his diaries. He leaves a lot of things open, which is maddening to some of his fans who want to know how certain things work. And he's like, no, just take it as it is. And he has this underlying tension of the supernatural versus the super-natural. And you get the difference between the two. And for example, Yennefer has a vision where she's talking to some female voice. It is never explained if it is God, if it is her own guilt, if it is a personification of the force of nature. It is never explained what that is. You may take away from that whatever you would like. Yes, Stephen.
This is kind of, it's not well formed, but I was fascinated when you were saying about he has like reverse climate change. I'm remembering a Spielberg film, maybe from 20 years ago, where the whole Earth.
You mean The Day After Tomorrow?
I think that might have been it.
Yeah.
Was that influenced? Do you think?
I don't think so. There was. I've done some work on, and I talk about it in the book a bit. I've done some work on climate fiction, or what we call cli-fi, and it was very fashionable back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s to have ice ages as your climate change. So climate change can go either way. I mean, we think of it in our world right now, anthropogenic climate change. Global temperatures are on the upswing. When you think more generally about just climate change in fiction, you will find examples either way. You will see floods, you will see droughts, you will see ice ages, you will see extreme heat. And so the fact that he is having an ice age is not unusual. We might think of it unusual just by looking around us, but for the time that he was, growing up reading science fiction, and also the time, and even today, there are still stories put out about unnatural ice. You got Snowpiercer, about the train that goes around the world and can't stop because the whole world is frozen. So there's still cli-fi being produced today that has artificial ice ages or unnatural ice ages. Sylvia.
Hi, it seems like timing is crucial because the weather, we all know, changes like 5 times a day sometimes. And you can have cold years and warm years, which are at least in part due to things like El Nino and La Nina and whatever comes between. But finding a cycle that matches with the astronomical changes is, I suppose if you tried hard enough, you could find a cycle that matched with anything.
Mm-hmm.
and correlation is not causation.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that seems like something you know a lot about and can finesse better than I can because I'm being kind of vague here. But it seems to me like, the argument in the paragraph you have at the end could come out of the mouth of someone who thought there was or there wasn't climate change. Mm-hmm. Someone who thought there wasn't could say, well, that's a weird 100 years. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 100 years? So what's your answer and rationale about that kind of thing?
Because the first and today seminal peer review paper appeared in Science in 1976, Hayes et al. Variations in the Earth's orbit pacemaker for the ice ages. And so the science is very well defined and very concrete. And Sapkowski knew enough to be able to find the science, tweak it slightly for his own use. So the idea of the Milankovitch cycles is well-established science. It's taught in basically any reputable course on the science of climate change will mention the Milankovitch cycles. Now, is that the only driver? Of course not. But that is an underlying astronomical driver. Of course, now we have to deal with anthropogenic climate change, which counteracts that sort of thing. So climate is incredibly complicated, and there are many, many things. The Milankovitch cycles do explain periodicities in ice ages seen in the geological record, but they are one piece of a puzzle. And what's interesting is of those three things that Milankovitch said could affect, it turns out that the only one that doesn't is the shape of the Earth's orbit. It's the other two. In Sapkowski's world, he finds the shape of the orbit to be an easier idea, so he includes that as one of the, he makes that tweak, which is different. So
I guess for applications purposes, like there's, if you could calibrate human-induced climate change to exactly counteract whatever was going on with ice age cycles, that would be convenient. On the other hand, as a biologist, the only problem with all of this is that it's happening too quickly right now for organisms to keep up.
Right.
I mean, otherwise we'd be fine if we had a couple millennia for everything to adapt. So, yeah, it's a tricky thing to deal with.
Go back over 100 years to Svante Arrhenius, who you know of, Arrhenius from chemistry. And he actually thought that the great thing about the Industrial Revolution was that it would belch all of this carbon into the atmosphere and make England nice and warm. Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, do you think we'll ever know enough to be able to, other than stop, like let's have less...
Would you stop messing with the environment? Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Yeah.
No.
And we never know when an asteroid's going to come and hit us and knock everything.
But there's a reason why Mary Shelley's book is subtitled The Modern Prometheus. When you play with the god's fire, bad things tend to happen. And so saying that humanity can go in there and try tweaking all of, when we can't even predict the weather accurately 72 hours from now, is just sheer folly, in my opinion. So.
Okay, you were talking about the long passage of science and saying, creative writing folk would say, don't do that. So, but he does, and he's really popular. Explain this to me.
I think he is popular partly because of the geekiness of it. People who love that sort of imagined world with details sort of glom onto it. And I think that people who love Sapkowski know and admit that he is probably not the most finessed writer on the planet, and you just embrace that and move on and you go along for the ride. It's one of the things, and this is, he does sometimes have these long passages of exposition, and you just like, okay, it's just like Tolkien will sometimes break out in poetry, and some people just skip the poetry and go back to where the prose picks up, so, yeah.
And you said he was an economist by training. Does he still do anything?
He does this sort of, he writes, to the best of my knowledge, he just writes, and he's written other stuff besides this. He's written other stuff, but so this is what he's most famous for. So he is a full-time writer. Yeah.
And do you play the games too?
I don't do games.
Okay. All right.
The games are set after the action in the novels. So, in case anybody's interested.
Any other questions?
Sure.
It sounds as though he wasn't isn't a great writer, that he writes interesting worlds and characters and situations. And I find that when I get hooked on a book, it's because of the writing. That the writing hits me first, and then whatever comes, I'll follow along. But it's an interesting. I'll look into that.
There's another problem in that we are reading this in translation, and there have been a number of studies by Polish scholars showing how a lot of his humor does not translate to English correctly. And so we, meaning the English-speaking reading world, are missing out on another complete layer of his universe because we don't, and I've had, when I was writing the book, I actually sent it to a Polish scholar who does work in this sort of work, and I said, am I characterizing anything wrong here? And he found a couple, he translated some things from Polish for me, some interviews that Sapkowski had done, and he pointed out some places where I had done some things that were kind of cringeworthy and saved me a lot of embarrassment. But yeah, it's very difficult when you're working with works that have been translated from their native tongue.
And so is this book going to catch fire among the Witcher people?
We were hoping that it would, but there's been a tremendous amount of controversy about the Netflix series and the fact that it's not following the books and the fact that Henry Cavill is gone and a lot of political, well, you know, I think it said he was replaced by Liam Hemsworth for season 4 and 5, but and also there's been some overt racism by some of the fandom who did not appreciate the fact that some of the characters are portrayed by persons of color because they claim there's no colored people in Poland. This is to which Sapkowski said, "This is a fantasy world. I didn't describe the skin color of my characters. Get a life." I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but so, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Chris.